For centuries, a quiet English village has harbored one of history's most seductive conspiracies: that Elizabeth I, Queen of England, was never a queen at all, that she died as a child, replaced by a peasant boy, and that the most powerful woman of the 16th century was, biologically, a man. It's a story that has captivated historians, novelists, and conspiracy theorists alike. But today, we're not here to romanticize it. We're here to dismantle it, piece by piece, bone by bone, using the very science and historical record that its believers conveniently ignore. Think about the most private moment of your day. Now imagine that moment, every single one of them, being witnessed by at least 6 women who have known your body since you were a child. That was the daily reality of Elizabeth I. The Privy Chamber was not simply a bedroom. It was a living institution. A carefully regulated inner sanctum governed by strict protocols established under Henry VIII's own household ordinances of 1526. Access was controlled, documented, and hierarchical. The women who served within it were not random attendants. They were hand-picked aristocrats bound by oath. Women who dressed the queen, bathed her, helped her onto and off her bed, managed her menstrual linen. A task so intimate it was recorded and tracked by the ladies of the bedchamber as a matter of royal health. And chief among them was Cat Ashley. Catherine Ashley had been Elizabeth's governess since 1537, when Elizabeth was barely 4 years old. She was present through every stage of the princess's physical development, through illness, through adolescence, through the psychological wreckage left by the fall of Catherine Howard, and the imprisonment of Elizabeth herself in 1554. If any human being on Earth knew Elizabeth's body with clinical familiarity, it was Cat Ashley. The Bisley theory asks us to believe that this woman, who had dedicated her entire adult life to this child, either participated in an act of high treason or was so catastrophically deceived that she failed to notice, while bathing and dressing a person daily, that the girl she had raised had been replaced by a boy from a village. The biological reality makes this even harder to accept. A 9-year-old boy and a 9-year-old girl are not interchangeable. Even prepubescent children carry anatomical differences observable to a trained caregiver. Pelvic structure, the ratio of shoulder to hip width, the texture of developing tissue. These are details invisible to a stranger, but glaringly apparent to someone who had performed intimate care for years, and the Privy Chamber was never staffed by just one person. At full function, Elizabeth's inner household employed multiple ladies of the bedchamber, alongside gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber. A rotation of attendants ensuring the Queen was almost never physically alone. The ordinances of the royal household, preserved in the British Library, make clear that even the monarch's sleep was supervised. Women slept in adjoining rooms with doors left ajar. Night emergencies, illness, menstrual discomfort, all of it managed, witnessed, and in many cases, discreetly recorded. The Bisley theory doesn't just require one person to keep a secret, it requires an entire institution, one built explicitly around physical proximity and intimate knowledge, to maintain a collective silence about something that would have been, to any one of them, immediately and unmistakably obvious. But here's where the theory becomes not just improbable, but structurally impossible. Because the Privy Chamber was not merely a social arrangement, it was a political one. These women held real power, and access to the monarch meant influence over policy, patronage, and succession. Any lady of the bedchamber who discovered that the Queen was biologically male would have held the most devastating political weapon in Tudor England. Treason charges were built on far less. The execution of Anne Boleyn was engineered on whispered accusations and fabricated confessions. To believe that no one in that chamber, not one woman, across 4.5 decades, ever used that knowledge, attempted to weaponize it, or even confided it to a priest, stretches credibility far beyond what historical human behavior actually supports. So the intimacy barrier alone should be enough to close the case. But the Bisley theory has a second problem, and this one is written into biology itself. Even if a substitution had somehow survived the Privy Chamber, even if every woman who bathed and dressed Elizabeth I had been blindfolded by loyalty or fear, biology itself would have issued a deadline. And that deadline would have been brutal. Male puberty is not a subtle process. Between the ages of 11 and 15, the male body undergoes a cascade of physiological changes that are, for the most part, impossible to conceal. The larynx descends and enlarges, producing the voice break that is one of the most acoustically distinct events in human development. The mandible widens, the brow ridge becomes more pronounced, Testosterone drives an increase in shoulder width relative to the hips, reshapes the nasal cartilage, and accelerates long bone growth in patterns measurably different from female adolescent development. These are not cosmetic variations. They are skeletal, permanent, structural, and visible to anyone in close physical proximity. Elizabeth I acceded to the throne in 1558 at 25 years of age. If the Bisley substitution occurred in 1543 as the legend claims, then this alleged impostor would have navigated the entirety of male puberty. Every voice crack, every skeletal shift, every emergence of facial hair, while under daily observation by some of the most politically attentive women in England, and then governed a nation for 45 years without a single credible witness ever documenting what should have been anatomically undeniable. The lead-based cosmetics argument that Elizabeth's famous white makeup masked her true features collapses under basic forensic logic. Ceruse, the lead carbonate compound she used, was applied to the face and upper chest. It was a skin lightening agent, not a bone restructuring tool. It could not narrow a masculine jaw. It could not raise a descended larynx. It could not feminize a skeletal frame that testosterone had already reorganized at the cellular level. Foreign ambassadors who met Elizabeth in person described her as tall and slender, with fine hands and a distinctive reddish-gold hair, features consistent with her known Tudor genetics. The Venetian ambassador Il Schifanoia, writing in 1557, described her in terms that emphasized a decidedly feminine bearing. None of the diplomatic dispatches preserved in the calendar of state papers, documents written by trained political observers with every incentive to report biological anomalies to their home courts, contain anything approaching a suggestion that England's monarch was anatomically male. And those ambassadors were watching carefully. Elizabeth's marriage prospects were the central geopolitical question of her reign. Every European court had a vested interest in her reproductive capacity. If even one ambassador had detected something phenotypically irregular, a jawline, a voice, a physical proportion that didn't align, that intelligence would have traveled to Madrid, Paris, and Rome within weeks. It would have been weaponized. Instead, the diplomatic record is silent on anything of the kind. The Bisley theory doesn't just ask us to disbelieve one person's observation. It asks us to disbelieve an entire continent of politically motivated witnesses, across 4.5 decades, all of whom failed to notice what any modern endocrinologist could identify in a single consultation. But if the biology is this conclusive, why did the anomalies exist at all? Why did Elizabeth behave in certain documented moments in ways that struck contemporaries as medically unusual? That question has an answer, and it has nothing to do with a boy from a village. Henry VIII was not a sentimental father, but he was an obsessive one. Obsessive about lineage, about legitimacy, about the physical proof of his dynasty walking in the world. He had executed a wife, broken with Rome, and dismantled 1,000 years of English religious tradition, all in the pursuit of a male heir who bore his features and carried his blood. The idea that this man, one of the most physically imposing and politically paranoid monarchs in European history, could be presented with a substitute child and fail to recognize the deception requires a suspension of reason that the historical record simply does not support. Henry met Elizabeth with some regularity in her later childhood. A royal portrait commission in 1544, just 1 year after the alleged Bisley substitution, depicted Elizabeth alongside her father and siblings in the family of Henry VIII, a politically charged image designed to assert dynastic legitimacy. If a substitution had occurred in 1543, an impersonator would have been sitting for that portrait under the direct gaze of court painters, courtiers, and a king whose entire psychological architecture was built around the identification and verification of his own bloodline. Beyond the personal, there was the institutional. Henry's court employed royal physicians whose access to the monarch's children was not optional. Dr. William Butts, Henry's personal physician, held close oversight of the royal household's health throughout the 1540s. Medical examination of royal children, for illness, for developmental assessment, for the management of the fevers that killed so many Tudor offspring, was routine. Any competent physician conducting even a cursory physical assessment would have identified a biological male immediately. The notion that these examinations either never occurred or were uniformly falsified requires a conspiracy so vast it becomes structurally self-defeating. And then there is Cat Ashley herself. The Bisley theory, in its most charitable form, requires Catherine Ashley to have made a decision, in a moment of panic, in a small English village, to commit an act of high treason against the crown, to sustain that treason for the remainder of her natural life, and to do so knowing that discovery meant not just execution, but the specific horror of Tudor punishment for treason: hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, burning or beheading for women, the tower, the rack, the slow institutional destruction of everyone connected to the accused. Kat Ashley was not a reckless woman. She had already been imprisoned in the Tower in 1549, not for treason, but merely for allowing the Lord Admiral Thomas Seymour inappropriate access to the young Elizabeth. That experience, by all historical accounts, shattered her. She emerged from it diminished, frightened, and deeply aware of how quickly royal favor could become royal fury. The idea that this same woman, freshly traumatized by imprisonment, would then voluntarily sustain the most dangerous deception in English history for decades out of loyalty to a dead child she had failed to protect, is not a portrait of human psychology. It is a fantasy. What the historical record actually shows is a woman who spent the rest of her life in devoted, documented service to Elizabeth, serving as chief gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber until her death in 1565. A woman whose relationship with the Queen was described by contemporaries as one of the closest personal bonds in the court. That bond was real, documented, and rooted in decades of shared experience. It was not the bond of an accomplice. It was the bond of a woman who had known Elizabeth I, the biological, continuous, uninterrupted Elizabeth, since before the girl could read. The paternal argument and the Ashley argument converge on the same conclusion. The Bisley substitution would have required not courage, but a collective madness. A simultaneous decision by physicians, courtiers, a paranoid king, foreign ambassadors, and a traumatized governess to either ignore or actively conceal something that was, in every biological and institutional sense, impossible to hide. So, if the theory is this demonstrably flawed, why has it survived? Why does it keep resurfacing in books and documentaries, in corners of academic debate, generation after generation? Because the anomalies that inspired it were real. And their true explanation is far more human, far more tragic, and far more interesting than a boy from Bisley. Elizabeth I never married. She never produced an heir. She refused, across 4.5 decades of relentless political pressure, to allow any physician to conduct a formal fertility examination. She described her own body in terms that struck contemporaries as unusual, famously declaring herself to have the heart and stomach of a king, and she governed with a psychological intensity that many around her characterized as something beyond ordinary female temperament by 16th century standards. These anomalies are real, they are documented, and they are precisely what the Bisley theory latches onto as its primary evidence. But anomalies are not proof of substitution. They are invitations to ask better questions. The medical literature is unambiguous on one point. Chronic psychological trauma produces measurable physiological consequences. Hypothalamic amenorrhea, the suppression of the menstrual cycle triggered by sustained stress, malnutrition, or emotional shock, is not a modern diagnosis. Its symptoms were documented in Tudor-era medical texts, even if the mechanism was not yet understood. A woman experiencing prolonged amenorrhea in the 16th century would have been perceived as constitutionally unusual, potentially infertile, and medically anomalous, none of which required her to be biologically male. Elizabeth's childhood was, by any clinical measure, a sustained trauma sequence. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded when Elizabeth was 2 years old. An event that was not simply a personal loss, but a public, politically engineered humiliation that stripped Elizabeth of her legitimacy and her place in the succession simultaneously. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, was executed when Elizabeth was 8. She was imprisoned in the Tower at 20 years old, under genuine threat of execution during the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554. She lived for years under house arrest, under surveillance, under the constant awareness that her survival was contingent on political calculation rather than familial love. The endocrinological consequences of this kind of chronic early life stress are now well established. Elevated cortisol levels sustained across developmental years can suppress estrogen production, delay or disrupt pubertal milestones, and produce long-term irregularities in reproductive function. Dr. Thomas Hucke, one of Elizabeth's own royal physicians, recorded concerns about her menstrual irregularity as early as the 1560s. Not as a mystery, but as a clinical observation consistent with a woman of her constitution and history. The refusal of marriage and medical examination takes on an entirely different character when viewed through this lens. Elizabeth had watched with perfect clarity what happened to women who placed their bodies under the jurisdiction of powerful men. Her mother had been destroyed by one. Her stepmother Catherine Parr had nearly been arrested by one. The act of submitting to a husband, legally, physically, medically, was not for Elizabeth an abstract political calculation. It was a visceral, trauma-informed aversion rooted in lived experience. Modern psychology has a precise term for this pattern of behavior. The 16th century simply called her difficult. Her famous statement under that she had the heart and stomach of a king was not a biological confession. It was a rhetorical weapon, deployed deliberately in her speech at Tilbury in 1588, before troops preparing to face the Spanish Armada. It was a performance of authority in a political language her soldiers would understand. Reading it as anatomical evidence requires stripping it entirely of its context and its audience. What the Bisley theory mistakes for biological impossibility is, in fact, the entirely coherent psychological portrait of a woman who had been taught repeatedly and brutally that her body was a political object, and who spent her entire adult life refusing to let anyone treat it as one. The anomalies are real, but they point not to a village in Gloucestershire. They point inward to the interior life of one of the most psychologically complex monarchs in European history. And yet, here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while the Bisley theory is a logistical myth, the medical records that surround Elizabeth I are not entirely without mystery. The ambassadorial dispatches, the physician's notes, the formal medical assessments of 1566 and 1603, documents that the Bisley theorists have misread and misused, still contain details that the official historical narrative has never fully resolved. The substitution never happened. But something about Elizabeth I's biology was, by the standards of her own time, quietly and persistently remarkable. And that story, the real one, grounded in surviving primary sources rather than Victorian folklore, it is one that history has largely chosen to leave in the archive. So let's be precise about what we have established and what we have not. We have not proven that Elizabeth I was a perfectly ordinary woman by the biological standards of her age. The documented record does not support that conclusion either. What we have proven, methodically, using the same primary sources that Bisley theorists selectively cite, is that the specific mechanism of substitution they propose is not merely unlikely. It is logistically, biologically, and institutionally impossible. A substitution in 1543 would have required the simultaneous silence of an entire privy chamber, staffed by women who performed daily intimate care. It would have required Henry VIII, a king whose pathological obsession with dynastic legitimacy reshaped an entire nation, to fail to recognize his own child. It would have required royal physicians conducting routine examinations to either miss or conceal anatomical evidence that any practitioner of basic medicine would have identified immediately. It would have required Catherine Ashley, a woman already broken by a single Tower imprisonment, to maintain the most dangerous secret in Tudor England for the remaining 22 years of her life, without once, in any letter, any confession, any deathbed statement, leaving a trace. And it would have required every foreign ambassador representing every major European power, men with direct financial and geopolitical incentives, to detect exactly this kind of biological anomaly. To watch Elizabeth I for 45 years and collectively see nothing. The Bisley Boy is not a suppressed truth. It is a Victorian confection, a story first recorded by Reverend Thomas Keble in the 19th century, attributed to local oral tradition, and entirely absent from any document produced during Elizabeth's own lifetime. There is no contemporaneous source, no Tudor-era letter, no diplomatic dispatch, no court record. The entire edifice rests on a 19th century clergyman's account of what villagers allegedly said, centuries after the events in question allegedly occurred. That is not history. That is folklore wearing history's clothing. But here is what makes this story genuinely worth your attention. Because the Bisley theory's failure does not mean the medical questions surrounding Elizabeth I are resolved. The formal medical assessments of 1566, conducted amid intense parliamentary pressure for the Queen to marry and produce an heir, contain language that her own physicians used carefully, almost evasively. The reports submitted to the Privy Council described her condition in terms that were, even by the diplomatic standards of Tudor medical communication, unusually guarded. And the final records from 1603, documenting the weeks before her death, raise questions about her physical deterioration that standard historical accounts have consistently underexplored. These documents are not secret. They exist in the Public Record Office, in the Calendar of State Papers Domestic, in the collections of the British Library. They have been available to scholars for generations. What has not been done, with the rigor that the subject deserves, is a systematic forensic reading of those records against what we now understand about the endocrinological and psychological consequences of Elizabeth's specific life history. That is the real investigation, not a ghost story about a boy buried in a Gloucestershire churchyard, but a serious, evidence-based examination of what the surviving primary sources actually say about one of the most medically scrutinized and simultaneously most medically guarded monarchs in the history of the English crown. The Bisley lie has had its century and a half of attention. It has served its purpose as a provocative footnote, a cocktail party controversy, a shorthand for Tudor mystery. But it has also, in a very real sense, done damage, because it has allowed the actual anomalies in the documentary record to be dismissed by association. Serious historians, understandably reluctant to be grouped with Victorian folklore, have stepped away from questions that genuinely merit engagement. Elizabeth I was a biological woman. The evidence for that conclusion is, as we have examined today, overwhelming and convergent across multiple independent sources. But she was also a woman whose body bore the measurable imprint of extraordinary psychological stress, whose medical history was managed with unusual opacity by the people closest to her, and whose physical reality in the final years of her reign was documented in terms that her own court found difficult to interpret. Those are the questions that remain open. Those are the documents that still hold something worth finding. The Tudor Enigma, the full forensic dossier on Elizabeth's surviving medical records, is linked in the description below. Not as speculation, as source material. Because the truth, when you actually read the documents, is always stranger than the legend.